नमस्कार। स्वातंत्र वीर सावरकर जी की 137वीं जयंती पर हम आपके समक्ष उपस्थित हैं। रामभाऊ माळगी प्रबोधिनी के इस पेज से आप हमको सुन पा रहे हैं और हमारे बीच जुड़े हैं डॉक्टर विक्रम संपत। हम सब जानते हैं डॉक्टर विक्रम संपत अभी बैंगलोर से हमारे साथ जुड़े हैं। आपने सावरकर इकोस फ्रॉम अ फॉरगॉटन पास्ट 1883 टू 1924 नामक एक पुस्तक लिखी है, जो कि आप सावरकर की पुस्तकें लिख रहे हैं, उसका पहला एडिशन है और बहुचर्चित पुस्तक है। आज डॉक्टर विक्रम संपत हमारे सामने जुड़े हैं और वे जिस विषय पर बात करने वाले हैं वो है टाइमलेस सावरकर, अ विजन दैट इज कमिंग टू फ्रूशन। साथ में श्री रविंद्र साठे जी, रामभाऊ माळगी प्रबोधिनी के महासंचालक भी जुड़े हुए हैं। मैं साठे जी से विनम्र निवेदन करता हूं कि वे डॉक्टर विक्रम संपत का परिचय करें और इस कार्यक्रम की शुरुआत करें।
सभी दर्शकों को मेरा प्रणाम एंड वेरी गुड इवनिंग टू ऑल ऑफ यू। हम सब जानते हैं कि आज सावरकर जी की जयंती है। सावरकर जी को अभिवादन करते हुए मैं आप सभी का हृदय से स्वागत करता हूं। खास करके आज के जो वक्ता है माननीय डॉक्टर विक्रम संपत जी। विक्रम जी, आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है और प्रारंभ में ही आपके प्रति कृतज्ञता व्यक्त करता हूं। वैसे इस सावरकर जयंती के अवसर पर रामभाऊ माळगी प्रबोधिनी और सावरकर दर्शन प्रतिष्ठान, इन दो संस्थाओं द्वारा यह कार्यक्रम का आयोजन हो रहा है। तो इन दोनों संस्थाओं की तरफ से मैं आप सभी का हृदय से स्वागत करता हूं। जैसे कि मेरे सहयोगी रवि जी ने कहा कि विक्रम संपत जी आज हमारे मध्य में। वैसे विक्रम संपत जी के बारे में बहुत कुछ हम बता सकते हैं, बट आई विल इंट्रोड्यूस इन ब्रीफ अबाउट डॉक्टर विक्रम संपत। Vikram Sampath is Bangalore-based historian and a noted author. Dr. Sampath has a doctorate in history and music from the University of Queensland, Australia. He is currently a senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library located in Delhi, an engineer as well as mathematician from BEATS, Pilani, and an MBA in finance from SP Jain Institute of Management in Mumbai. He also trained Carnatic vocalist. He has established the Archive of Indian Music, India's first digital sound archive for vintage recordings. A great contribution by Dr. Sampath. He is the founder director of the Bangalore Literature Festival, Indic Thoughts Festival, and Z Group's Earth, a cultural fest. As I mentioned earlier, he is a well-known author and historian. Till date, he has authored 4 books, including of Great Savarkar. The books he has written, namely Splendors of Royal Mysore, The Untold Story of the Vodeyars. My Name is Gauhar Jan, The Life and the Times of a Musician and Voice of the Veena. S. Balachandar, a biography. Dr. Sampath was awarded the Sahitya Academy First Yuva Puraskar in English Literature and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for the book on his Gauhar Jan. विक्रम जी, आपका हृदय से स्वागत करता हूँ और आपने समय निकाला हमारे लिए, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। हम सभी अब आपको सुनना चाहेंगे। फिर से एक बार आपका स्वागत करता हूँ और सभी दर्शकों का भी स्वागत करता हूँ और प्रणाम।
विक्रम जी बोलना शुरू करें उससे पहले सभी दर्शकों से मेरा निवेदन है कि इस कार्यक्रम का स्वरूप कुछ इस तरह से रहेगा कि लगभग 30 से 35 मिनट विक्रम जी अपनी बात रखेंगे और उसके बाद हम सभी उनसे अलग अलग हमारी जो जिज्ञासाएं हैं, प्रश्न है सावरकर जी के, वो सभी पूछ सकेंगे। फेसबुक पर जहां ये कार्यक्रम लाइव हो रहा है वहां भी आप कमेंट सेक्शन में क्वेश्चंस अपने पूछ सकते हैं या प्रबोधिनी के ट्विटर हैंडल के कमेंट्स में भी आप क्वेश्चंस पूछ सकते हैं। मैं आपकी ओर से वो क्वेश्चन विक्रम संपत जी से पूछूंगा और उनके जवाब हम ऑनलाइन फेसबुक के लाइव के जरिए जानेंगे। तो ओवर टू यू विक्रम जी।
नमस्कार, सभी दर्शकों को मेरा सादर प्रणाम और रामभाऊ माळगी प्रबोधन और रविंद्र साठे जी और रवि जी का धन्यवाद कि आपने मुझे आज आमंत्रित किया इस चर्चा के लिए, और वो भी एक ऐसे ऐतिहासिक दिन पे जो स्वातंत्र वीर विनायक दामोदर सावरकर जी का 137th जयंती दिवस है। तो हमारी बातचीत हो रही थी इससे पहले। मैं शायद अंग्रेजी में थोड़ा और कंफर्टेबल फील करता हूँ, तो ज्यादातर मेरी जो भाषण है मैं कोशिश करूंगा थोड़ा थोड़ा हिंदी भी उसमें मिश्रित करके बात करूं, पर ज्यादातर मैं आपकी अनुमति से अंग्रेजी में बात करना चाहूंगा। So the topic that has been decided for today's discussion is timeless Savarkar, an idea whose time has come for fruition. Now, when we talk of this whole concept of timelessness of an individual, that's very important to realize that a person can have such far-reaching and far-sighted views which keep him or her relevant, and where death cannot actually snatch them away from our midst, despite this particular individual having died in 1966. Now, in the case of Savarkar ji, his timelessness, I always say, comes in a package of both positive as well as in a negative manner. Let's dispose of the negative first before we get on to the positive aspects of his timelessness. I mean, even as we speak, the city that I am in, Bangalore, as you all know, there is a controversy raging here over whether a flyover needs to be named after this man. And imagine a country which spends its time and energy on something as trivial as this. But then that is exactly what Savarkar does in terms of drawing public attention. Almost every election rally, his name is invoked. In the Maharashtra elections, in the run-up to that, how the whole idea whether he should be given a Bharat Ratna or not formed the basis for political speeches, for manifestos of political parties. You have state governments which keep giving, Rajasthan state government deciding this huge issue of whether Veer should be prefixed before his name. The Chhattisgarh chief minister is saying something else about whether the two-nation theory was caused by him. During a debate in parliament on the CAA, members of the Congress again accused Savarkar of being the proponent of the two-nation theory. So I rarely see somebody of our past, particularly of our freedom struggle, whose name gets invoked in so many ways by those in support of him and those who are against him. But then sadly, the tragedy of this man, I think, is that while those who are opposing him and those who are supporting him, they base most of their arguments and assessments on either misinformation or lack of information. So the first part is still probably, it's the political need, it's bias, it's all kinds of other necessities, but lack of information on a person whom we even claim to be very fond of, I think that is a little disturbing. But I do get it. This man was a prolific writer, almost 5,000, 6,000 pages of written literature throughout the course of his life on various aspects, as a poet, as a thinker, as an ideologue, as a playwright, as an editor, journalist, and an active politician. His views become very, very wide-ranging on a wide range of topics. So to be able to read all of that, to be able to understand all of that, and to present cogent arguments in favor of him also becomes quite a difficult task. So in such a circumstance, what do we do? So that's where this whole timelessness of this man comes into question. But there again, I want to put one disclaimer. When we have topics like this, there is a tendency to praise the person to the skies and say he had an answer to everything, he had foreseen this, he had done that. And so that's a typical Indian tendency where we hero worship somebody so much. And mind you, Savarkar himself would have been very unhappy with that, because all his life, and that is an important point I thought which is necessary to start off with, that he would always encourage people who had differing viewpoints to come and argue with him, to have a debate in the typical Indian tradition of Vad, Vivad, Samvad, which needs to happen. And that's the bedrock of a liberal democracy, where we accommodate viewpoints which we may or may not agree with. So I think this whole, and he would always say, don't make me an idol. Because once we make an idol out of somebody, we cannot take any dispassionate or an objective assessment of that person. So we need to see, I think, Savarkar in that context and not attribute everything, saying he had an answer to this or that. And I get asked this pretty often, and I'm saying this disclaimer right at the beginning only for that reason, that whenever there's a controversy, a news channel would come and ask, so what was Savarkar's views on abrogation of Article 370? What would Savarkar's views be on LGBT rights? Now, it's not necessary that a person needs to have a view on all aspects of public, political, or social life. So unlike, of course, his intellectual counterpart, his rival Mahatma Gandhi, who wrote on a wide range of topics, Savarkar's range of thinking and topics were largely around India, her strategy in terms of national security, in terms of foreign policy, very briefly about economics too, social reforms, and his views largely on the consolidation of the Hindu community. So I'll touch upon all of this briefly. Now, quite coincidentally, as Satheji mentioned, I'm currently working on the second volume of this book on Savarkar, which takes the story ahead from 1924 to 1966. And quite coincidentally, a few days back, I came across a couple of articles that Savarkar wrote in the Shraddhanand. Now, this was the newspaper that the Savarkar brothers only started, and Savarkar was one of the editors, writers, journalists for this newspaper. The newspaper itself was started in memory and in honor of Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj, who was murdered in 1926 by a Muslim fanatic, Abdul Rashid. Now, in this, I came across a set of 4 articles, which I thought will be a good way to start, where we've all the time been told that this man was a British stooge who had collaborated with the British, who didn't actually have a vision for how we need to win our freedom, and quietly took a pension and stayed at home, which is what is the usual talk. I was quite surprised to see there are very, very huge articles that are written, and this was between the end of February and the first week of March 1928, where he writes 4 articles where he prophesizes what the world scenario is going to be in the next 10 to 12 years. And I thought it's a good segue to begin with, where I'll quote a few aspects of these articles. On 16th February 1928, in the first article, he says, "The best opportunity to win freedom is when the rulers are fiercely fighting their powerful enemy. The difficulty of one country is the opportunity of another country." The Emperor of England had said this in 1900, but our Indian leaders were unable to understand its implicit meaning. Had they understood its meaning, India would have been a free country long ago. The enslaved nation must always remain alert. They should watch the political developments in the bordering countries. If an opportunity is available, they should nurture cordial relations with them. They should also watch the relations between the rulers and the bordering countries. If war breaks out between the ruler and any other powerful nation, it makes the rulers weak. If so, the enslaved nation will be in a position to push forward their demands more aggressively. They may then resort to destabilize their rulers from within. All powerful nations, America, Italy, Germany, had openly revolted against their rulers to win their own freedom. So this almost starts as a prescription to how actually what ultimately happened with the naval mutiny which Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA led in 1946, which is what got India her freedom in 1947. The blueprint, the prescription for that was right here, way back in 1928. And he goes on to write, I won't be able to quote a lot of it, but then a little more of it, where he actually says that within 10 years, there is going to be a world war, across, which will get all the major powers of this of the world involved in the skirmish. And more important than that, he says that the last time the World War happened, 1914 to 18, India missed that opportunity. India missed that bus to use that opportunity to secure freedom for herself. We should not be repeating that mistake again. So he says the last war was a German war. The next war will be a Russian war. And we know how Russia got involved in the Second World War and so on. On the background of such a calculated and planned war on the Asian soil, India must be prepared to play a very decisive and important role. It must design its own strategy to derive maximum benefit if such a world war erupts. So, and then very interestingly, a paragraph in one of those 4 articles that I found, which would again be very relevant even as we speak today, what's happening in our borders with Nepal. He says, none of the Indian leaders have ever realized the importance of Nepal. Neither Nepal nor India were capable of assessing their own strengths and importance in the larger British Empire. Nepal's strategic location and Hindu ideology will prove to be a great advantage. India must realize it and assist Nepal and build unbreakable relationship with Nepal. India should plan to unite all the Hindus across the world and in Nepal and keep them undivided so that we can reap the maximum benefits of war if and when war erupts in the future. So I think this I thought was a great segue to begin this discussion on timelessness. So the timelessness that one talks about, it's almost political prophesizing that one does, crystal ball gazing as to what is going to happen in which part of the world. And the more important part is how best can we utilize that for India's interests. And that was the constant, principle of Savarkar, which was India first, nation first, and the utilitarian principle that he dealt with. So how did this man actually have this kind of foresight? And that came, I think, right from his childhood, which he spent in Bhagur in the Nashik district and later in the Nashik town itself. And thanks to his father, Damodar Pant, who encouraged this all the children to read a lot. So other than Hindu scriptures, Marathi literature, the Povadas, the ballads, and the Bakhars, the chronicles of Shivaji, Rana Pratap, and the Peshwas, Tanaji, and all of this that he read. He was a voracious reader who also read world literature, especially world history. As a little child of 8 or 9, he'd already read and mastered a short history of the world. Robert Spencer's liberal utilitarianism was something that really inspired him all the time. So maximum utility one can get out of any issue, that needs to be the guiding principle or the bedrock on which you need to strategize. So the talks that he would give as the leader of the Abhinav Bharat, the Mitra Mela in Nashik, were on the revolt of the Moors of Spain, the Dutch revolt in Netherlands, the lives of revolutionaries like Napoleon, Garibaldi, Mazzini from Italy, to an audience in Maharashtra which had probably not even known these names and not even thought of these outside the confines of their region. So right from childhood, this tendency to intellectualize, to gather that knowledge, to gather information about a subject before talking about it, was his hallmark. And that is why I think it becomes more appropriate, as I said right at the beginning, that we need to get information about him and read as much about him before even attempting to defend him or say anything for or against him. So this tendency of his continued all his life, of being able to read, assess, analyze, and then make forward predictions. Now, time and time again, I have maintained, much to many people's what would I say, discomfort, that I feel in my assessment after studying Savarkar to an extent possible, the ocean of literature that he has left behind, that if we dispassionately analyze after independence, particularly the trajectory that India has taken, I would time and time again say that to a large extent, it is Savarkar's vision of India that has fructified, and not to a large extent the opposing viewpoint intellectually and ideologically of Mahatma Gandhi. Of course, one has been elevated to the status of the father of the nation, and the other has been implicated in his assassination, though acquitted. The long ghost of that episode keeps haunting him even now. But ideologically, on several aspects, I think his views have come to fruition. And what are these several aspects? So, of course, right from the fact that his prescription of how the World War II needed to be taken advantage of to gain India her independence, it almost begins from there. A lot of other such prophecies that he made, particularly on the geopolitical and strategic interests of India before and after independence, are very noteworthy to mention. First of all, after independence, Gandhiji wanted a disbanding of our army. That we are a free nation now. We really don't. We are non-violent country, so we don't even need an army. So on the other hand, Savarkar always stressed for a strong militarized nation which could defend its borders, never be the first aggressor on anybody, which we as a civilization have never been. But then to protect yourself, it is necessary to protect yourself with strength. And I think that dates back to that very famous episode that kind of for me frames this ideological difference between Mahatma Gandhi and Veer Savarkar way back in 1908 or 9 when they met in London as young men. It was the Dashera festival, and there were speeches that were given by various leaders at the India House. Gandhi comes there from South Africa. He's invited by the Indian leaders at the India House, where he talks about the importance of Ram Rajya and also about a non-violent means to achieve, a free nation. So immediately after that, Savarkar comes to speak, and then he says, it's all very nice to talk about Ram Rajya, but then even to establish Ram Rajya, Lord Rama had to go and kill Ravana. It was not through non-violent means that he managed to, secure Sita back. So he had to take to war. He had to take to arms. And he says this whole idea of ahimsa is actually very alien to Indian and Hindu customs, because we see all our gods and goddesses with arms in their hands, and these are not just for fancy, but it's also a symbol that anything that is evil needs to be vanquished. So if you consider the British Raj, the British Empire, as evil, then they certainly need to be dealt with in that way. As I said again, you never be the first aggressor, but then anybody who is your oppressor, there is no point dealing with them in a nice way. And that is something that repeatedly comes in most of his writings. So be it his prophecy right in 1940, when Gandhiji at that time had said, there'll be Pakistan only on my dead body, even as Jinnah was making claims for that. All through, right from then, Savarkar kept mentioning that the die has been cast for the formation of Pakistan, and we in the Hindu Mahasabha are going to tooth and nail oppose that. And during that context, he said something which I think becomes very relevant today too, where he says, till a nation that is based on religious extremism exists beside India, she will not be able to live in peace. And we are seeing that happening almost ever since the birth of Pakistan and the incursion of Kashmir till probably this morning. So how do you deal with a neighbor like that? If Savarkar was probably in charge of policy planning for the country, particularly on army and strategy, it would be a different thing as to how to put a neighbor like this in place. So there also, the idea was never, you can give olive branches to somebody who respects that and also reciprocates that. So his philosophy, again, right from the book that he wrote, Shatruncha Shibirat, inside the enemy's camp. तो शत्रु के घर के अंदर घुस के उनको मारना है. तो ये नहीं है कि शत्रु से बात करो, अगर वो बात मानते हैं तो ठीक है, अगर बात नहीं मानते, बार बार उनसे दुहाई आप मांगते रहें, पर उसके बावजूद वो नहीं माने, तो उनको उसी भाषा में बात करनी चाहिए जो भाषा उनको समझ में आए. और शायद मुझे लगता है कि जो पुलवामा के बाद जो बालाकोट में हुआ, वो उसी का एक फलीभूत, उसी फिलॉसफी का फलीभूत मुझे लगता है, where we will not take things lying down anymore. We are even, eyeball to eyeball with China, maybe in Doklam, what's happening now in Ladakh. So everywhere, I think India and Indian national security is coming around to this view that we need to engage with a nation which is not so, on friendly terms with us, from that position of strength and assertiveness. And I think it's high time we did that, and not got restrained by local politics, local vote bank politics, which define your foreign policy. It's been 50-60 years after its formation, and Israel, for instance, a country which is so friendly towards India and with whom we have a lot in common, a lot to learn from, their anti-terror operations, their whole thrust on technology, whether it is IT, it's agriculture, whole range of startup ecosystem that Israel has, we've never, for silly vote bank politics of local considerations, we've always held a hostile view to Israel, including opposing its formation in the first place. There too, right then, Savarkar said that the Jews deserve that land of Israel and Palestine to the promised land, which needs to come to them. There are so many other countries which run on another religion, which need not covet this particular group, this land. So it needed someone like Narendra Modi to actually take that initiative to build those bridges with Israel. And we're seeing the results of that, the collaboration and what that is bringing for our country as a whole. Now, talking again on, since I mentioned China, I'll also mention that right in 1954, after 4 years after the Panchsheel was crafted by Pandit Nehru, the first prime minister, and this was immediately after the Chinese invasion of Tibet. It was Savarkar who had said this. And after what China has done to Tibet, kowtowing to the Chinese would whet its appetite. I won't be surprised if China feels emboldened to swallow Indian land, tempted by India's weak-kneed approach. And just 8 years later, he said this in 1954, and 8 years later in 1962, we know what happened between India and China. And we're continuing to see that as we speak as well. So here, these, the red flags that Savarkar had marked on Pakistan, on China, on our national security, particularly in the Northeast, where there was huge influx of the Muslims from the neighboring countries. There too, he had said, and I quote him again, migration of large number of Muslims in Assam threatens not only the local culture, but would also prove to be a national security problem for India on its northeast frontier. And we've seen that happening time and time again. But not paying heed to some of these prophecies has been disastrous for India, as we have seen in these last 70 years of our freedom. Now, since we're talking about foreign policy and so on, I'd also like to draw the attention of the listeners to what was Savarkar's guiding principle on India's the policy on other nations that India needs to follow. And he articulated this as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha in 1939 in the Calcutta session. And I'll again quote a little bit of his own words. He says, and I quote, "Our foreign policy will be guided from an outspoken and unalloyed Hindu point of view." Here, Hindu is, of course, a synonymous word for Indian. All those nations who are friendly or likely to be helpful to the Hindu Rashtra will be our friends and allies. All those who do neither, we will observe a policy of neutrality towards them, irrespective of any political ism that they choose to follow for themselves. No academic and empty slogans of democracy or Nazism or fascism can be our guiding principle of our foreign policy. Hindu interest alone will be our test. No more khilafats, no more Palestine afats can dupe us into suicidal sympathies and complications. Our relations with England too will be guided by the same Hindu policy, having the absolute independence of the Hindu Rashtra. So time and time again, I'm stressing on the same fact, the utilitarian aspect that he got right from reading Herbert Spencer in his childhood and the works of all the Indian heroes, Italian revolutionaries, guided this thought process that the nation first, national interest first, no other considerations of how our support to someone somewhere will influence local domestic policies or social structures, religious structures here, which was what was being tried with the Khilafat movement right in 1918. That, to my mind, forms the essence of Savarkar's policies, particularly with other countries. And I'm glad that slowly but steadily, we are now, I think, veering round to that viewpoint of what India's national policy when it comes to national security and foreign policy needs to be. Now, the other aspect that I'd like to touch on is the economic policy, on which there is not honestly much written or articulated, though the difference again between him and Gandhi, and I keep positing this, one against the other, not with any sense of competition between the two, but just the fact that these are two different ideas of India. And I think it's important to understand and analyze that. And probably finally the Constitution of India that came about was an amalgam of all these ideas of India, where tragically Savarkar is the only one who's never given credit for his ideas or thoughts, because he's an political untouchable, so to say, in India today, and has always been. So on the economic front, again, in the same Calcutta session, he says, and I quote, "Our immediate economic policy should be the national coordination of all class interests. We shall first of all welcome the machine." Someone who was, a strong believer of the machine age, the mechanization, industrialization, but at the same time, an approach which is in between that of the capitalist as well as the socialist Marxist viewpoint on economics, something of the middle, where again, like in the foreign policy and national security, it is national utility and national benefit that becomes the fulcrum, which is what is evident in what he says here. This is the machine age. The handcrafts will of course have their due place and encouragement, but national production will be on the biggest possible machine scale. The interests of both capital and labor will be subordinated to the requirement of the nation as a whole. Now, if an industry is flourishing, the profits will be shared in a large portion by the laborers. But on the contrary, if it is a losing concern, not only the capitalist, but to a certain extent, even the laborer will have to be satisfied with diminishing returns, so that the national industry as such may not altogether be undermined by the overbearing attitude of the selfish class interests of either the capitalists or the laborites. In short, the claims of capital and labor will be so coordinated from time to time as to enable the nation as a whole to develop its national industry and manufacture and make itself self-sufficient. So even in economics or the economic policy, it is a national industry, national interest, which becomes the key thing, not pandering to either the capitalist or to the working class, which are typical theories of economic policy have done, whether depending on whether you're on the capitalist side or on the socialist Marxist side. So that, to my mind, is again a common feature which draws from the other policies that I mentioned. Now, what about the other thorny issue that comes into picture? And I think that becomes one topic where he's beaten time and time again, which is what were his vision and thoughts when it came to the society and the role of minorities in India. There again, in the Hindu Rashtra Darshan, in one of his speeches, he makes it very clear. And I don't know, after even reading something like this, how somebody could call the vision as a divisive or a bigoted, exclusive kind of a vision. I'll again take the liberty of quoting him. He says, "I would like to relieve our non-Hindu countrymen of even a ghost of suspicion that we are prepared to emphasize that the legitimate rights of all minorities with regard to their religion, culture, and language will be expressly guaranteed, on one condition, that the equal rights of the majority also must not in any case be encroached upon or abrogated." Here again, I think it becomes important today, where the converse has actually happened when it comes to our domestic policy, when it comes to religions. The majority community is not allowed to run their own temples. Even as we speak, last week we had this whole issue of how the Tirupati property was set out to be auctioned by the Andhra government, and after a lot of public outcry, that order was rescinded. Just 2-3 weeks back, you had a Congress leader who said all the wealth of all the temples need to be nationalized so as to fight the whole corona pandemic, not ever mentioning that a lot of property, lot of riches also exist with other religious foundations as well, which also need to contribute if it's a national crisis. So this tendency was stemmed in the bud right in 1939 when Savarkar said this, and I continue quoting him. "Every minority may have separate schools to train their children in their own tongue. So, and their own religions, cultural institutions, they can receive government help also for these, but always in proportion to the taxes they pay into the common exchequer. The same principle must of course hold good in case of the majority also. So depending on how productive you are to the country, again coming to the same common thread that I mentioned, utility to the country. So if you as a community are contributing more to the national exchequer, to the national life, national industry, national economy, national security, then in proportion to that, you will also get incentives from the country's exchequer. Nobody is going to get extra privileges because one is a majority in population terms. Nobody is also going to get concessions only on terms of lesser number of people. It is how you contribute to this country. Based on that, the country will give back, incentives to you, grants, subsidize maybe your yatras, Hajj pilgrimage, or going to Mansarovar, whatever it is, depending on how much taxes you pay into the common, exchequer of the country. There again, in the national constitution of Hindu Rashtra, Hindustan, he mentions that the broad principle that all citizens should have, and I think this is important to note, that all citizens should have equal rights and obligations, irrespective of caste or creed, race or religion, provided they avow and owe an exclusive and devoted allegiance to the state. The fundamental rights of liberty of speech, liberty of conscience, of worship, of association will be enjoyed by all citizens alike. Whatever restrictions will be imposed on them in the interest of public peace and order of national emergency will not be based on religious or on racial considerations alone, but on common national grounds. So our formula, one man, one vote, makes it very clear that the conception of a Hindu Rashtra is in no way inconsistent with the development of a common Indian nation in which all sects and sections, races and religions, castes and creeds, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Anglo-Indians, etc., could all be welded together into one political state in terms of perfect equality. So, after reading statements like this, to then go on to call someone a communal and a bigoted vision, I really don't understand, because the whole idea here is one of what perhaps is now coming to fruition even in the current dispensation, at least in the way they formulate their policy. How much of it gets executed, that's another matter, but justice to all and appeasement of none. So in the eyes of the law, everybody is the same, irrespective of what caste, community, creed, religion you belong to. And I think that whole non-sentimental, unemotional approach where you are free to worship and do what you want, but let it be in the confines of your home. Don't bring your puja paddhatis and other things into the public space, or worse, into politics and policy, which incidentally the Congress actually did way back with, again, as I mentioned earlier, the Khilafat movement, where an entire community was mobilized on religious grounds to fight a religious cause, and that too not even in India, but several thousands and thousands of kilometers away, where this whole extraterritorial allegiance that was there to some other country and its people, that becomes a very problematic thing. And that is where the Hindutva that Savarkar propounded right from the confines of the Ratnagiri prison in 1923, base this theory of allegiance to this land. So the Punya Bhu, Asindhu Sindhu Paryanta that he talks about, right from the Indus to the ocean, the land mass, anybody who considers this land as their Punya Bhu, holy land, not in terms of religion, but as in terms of their loyalty, in terms of their allegiance to, and Pitrubhu, the land of their ancestors, will be a Hindu. Either this condition or that condition materializes, you would be called a Hindu, again, not in terms of religion, but in terms of a cultural, a nationalistic identity for yourself. So in such a scenario, the Hindu Rashtra that he had envisioned, it causes, it's almost like a dragon that scares everybody today. Oh, Hindu Rashtra is coming, Hindu Rashtra is coming, so-and-so community is not safe, and so on. But if you actually see the conception of it, it is very clear that everybody is going to get equal rights. Nobody, even the Hindus, are not going to get extra privileges just because you are more in number. And whatever benefits you receive is in direct proportion of what you contribute to the country. So I don't know, it's again very, very utilitarian and a national interest based approach in my view, which actually would have set the foundations for a very strong nation if it had been followed in these 70 years. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. You had appeasement, you had policies which were thought were important to pander to certain groups or communities or religions for actually petty vote bank politics, and the repercussions of that have been seen time and time again. But there again, I think the whole idea of whatever happened with the triple talaq law that was brought recently is one small step in that direction, where everybody, at least in terms of gender, everybody is same in terms of, in the eyes of the law. Where and how that would then translate to your civil laws, your personal laws, when it comes to important issues related to marriage, property, inheritance, and all of this, that one needs to see. That would be another step that takes that vision forward. But at the same time, Savarkar also as a social reformer. Now, there are aspects of Savarkar which constantly, in the bid to spread disinformation, he's only shown as this bigoted, very, very exclusivist kind of a person who didn't take people together, and he was an anti-Muslim, a very communal man, and all of that, which again I've actually disposed of. But then him as a revolutionary, which now slowly people are getting to understand, somebody who started India's first secret society, someone who went ahead to create the first ever student bonfire in Pune in the Ferguson College, someone who gave a call for complete independence even before the Congress ever thought of it. This was way back in 1905 when he was protesting against the partition of Bengal as a student. And then the kind of work he did in London as the kingpin of the India House, along with several other revolutionaries, the books he wrote there, the Marathi translation of Mazzini's biography, and the seminal work on the 1857 uprising, which he called the first war of Indian independence, which till then was called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British. The political assassinations that were done, the flag of independent India that was for the first time unfurled in 1907 in the International Socialist Conference in Stuttgart by Madam Bhikaji Kama and Sardar Singh Rana. All these aspects of his revolutionary life then as an active revolutionary are known. Slowly, we of course don't know that even after his release, conditional release in Ratnagiri, the Savarkar brothers were constantly in touch with all revolutionaries. There's so much of documentation which I'm now trying to unearth and also put together of the relation that was maintained with Bhagat Singh, with Chandrasekhar Azad, with all of them. Chandrasekhar Azad and Ganesh Damodar Savarkar met in Banaras just one day before Azad shot himself in Allahabad. So they had a lengthy discussion of, on what God alone knows. It was certainly something related to revolution, related to freedom. Similarly, the inspiration that Rash Bihari Bose got from Savarkar, where he calls him as a rising leader of New India in his Japanese paper Dai Ajia Shugi in 1939, and the whole conjecture that Savarkar inspired Subhash Chandra Bose to leave the country and form this army, which again ties back in a way to what I started with, that 1928 Shraddhanand article, where he says, take advantage of the situation of the war, and this time India should not miss the bus. You should ensure that the British are pushed out of India. So this revolutionary aspect, where one is an active revolutionary, then he's working from the background only because restrictions are put on him, and he doesn't want to get back to Kalapani for obvious reasons, that the amount of torture that one faced there. That is one aspect of Savarkar that is seldom spoken about, because it becomes difficult then to justify that one of the icons whom the left, particularly the CPI-CPIM, have appropriated, Bhagat Singh, held him in such high regard. The fact that Bhagat Singh used to use Savarkar's books as an entry criteria for people to enter into the HSRA, unless they've read Life of Barrister Savarkar or the 1857 war, people were not getting into the HSRA, because this kind of explained what revolution means and what revolutionaries need to do in India. So it becomes problematic to then attribute that to Savarkar and call him a revolutionary. And moreover, as I said earlier, he was not inspired by Karl Marx, but by the Italian revolutionaries, Mazzini and Garibaldi. So this aspect of Savarkar is kind of disposed of and never brought to light too much. But the other part which becomes very, very difficult, which also has a lot of bearing to today's India, is Savarkar as a social reformer. There again, I'm quite amazed many times when people make these broad allegations of casteism and Manuvad and all of that to someone like him, who actually in those 13 years that he spent in Ratnagiri put all those principles of Hindutva that he wrote in his book into practical application by trying to unify Hindu society. The 7 shackles of Hindu society that he spoke about, Vedokta Bandi, Vyavasay Bandi, Shuddhi Bandi, Sparsha Bandi, Beti Bandi, Roti Bandi, Shuddhi Bandi, all of these which form the basis for Samudra Bandi, where going outside the country, crossing the seas would lead to loss of caste. All these become the guiding principles for the social reform program that he does there. And these are all done, led by example, where members of the Ratnagiri Hindu Mahasabha, including him, actually go to the different Mahar Vadas, sing with them, inspire them to come and talk to them, clean their premises, then bring them slowly out of their confines, make them mix with members of the so-called upper caste. Together they celebrate Ganesh Chaturthi. There is an Asprishya Ganapati that is kept in 1925-26, where actually a Mahar, a Bhangi, all of these people are the ones who are performing the puja, and the Brahmin and the other upper castes are actually standing and taking blessings from them. The first time, untouchable children, children from the untouchable communities are made to sit along with children from the so-called upper caste and study. And you can imagine the kind of furor that would have created in an India then, when even now in 2020, caste wars and caste discriminations are so important. So some of these very, very practical, social reform projects that he implemented there: intercaste dining, intercaste marriage. Intercaste marriage is a problem in India even today, with honor killings and all of that happen in vast tracts of India. So to encourage that in that time, and at intercaste dining, where I don't know now, but even during the time he lived, even among the Brahmins, maybe in Maharashtra, a Deshastha would not sit along with a Chitpavan Brahmin and eat, or with a Konkanas, with anyone else. Whereas here there was a cafe in Ratnagiri where everybody could actually sit together and eat. So the kind of heckles that would have raised in conservative Orthodox Indian society at that time, you can well imagine. But then his social reform project then becomes like a model for India to follow, where time and time again he mentions, and here there is a lot of consonance with what he and Dr. Ambedkar propounded, of a complete dismantling of the Varnashram system, where the Varnashram system being, there's nothing Sanatan about it, he said. It's not as if, it's prescribed in any of our scriptures. Even when Lord Krishna says this in the Bhagavad Gita, Chatur Varnam Maya Srishtva, it is only based on gunas and not on the basis of birth. So all of us are born Shudra, he says, and then, slowly we elevate ourselves to the different levels of consciousness and intellect. And so anybody could be born in any caste, but can become a Brahmin, which is not a caste per se, but a symbol for intellect, for awareness, for elevated consciousness, and not just by terms of birth. So a great man's son need not always be great. So that was the principle on which he and Ambedkar also believed in. And that is one reason, though the two of them never met, Dr. Ambedkar had several letters of adulation to Savarkar, where he writes to him that you're the only one who has understood the importance of dismantling Varnashram as the only way to remove the scourge of casteism in India. Because as long as these 4 Varnas are there, the thousands and thousands of castes, subcastes that come out of these 4 Varnas, they will continue to proliferate. So you have to remove the base of this social malaise. Only then the problem can be treated. Surgery from the root of the tumor, only then the cancer can be treated. Just some chemotherapy here and there will not actually work. Unfortunately, I think that is one vision which India and Indian society are not ready even now. So we're still grappling with issues of caste, issues of unity between various communities that way. And there, a lot of Savarkar's works, Savarkar's writings, can provide us a roadmap, a vision as to how we can achieve that end. Another interesting point, and I think after that I will end and take up questions, particularly related to scientific temper. Now, time and time again, this term scientific temper is attributed to Pandit Nehru and to the temples of modern India, the dams, the IITs, the IIMs, and other things that he established. Certainly, no doubt. But scientific temper, if somebody could actually be the proponent of that in India, I would deem it as Savarkar, because rationalism, pragmatism, and this no-nonsense approach, where you even hurt so-called religious sentiments and emotions, it's okay. But if it is what the truth is and what is of utility to many people, then it becomes important. I'd like to actually quote again from him. So in 1934, as you know, there was an earthquake in Bihar. And as a response to that, Gandhiji had said that, it's because it's God's curse to us because we believe in the caste system. So as a rebuttal to that, again in the Shraddhanand, Savarkar says, and I quote him, "It is our misfortune in India that even someone as influential as Gandhiji invokes his inner voice to attribute the recent massive Bihar earthquake as God's punishment for the barbaric caste system. I still wait to hear what his inner voice will tell us about why Quetta was rocked by an earthquake." As if political leaders were not enough, our religious gurus are not far behind in raising such silly beliefs. The Shankaracharya and other religious leaders have sworn by scriptures to let us know that this earthquake was caused by attempts to dismantle the caste system. So it is funny how the logic works both ways. What can one say about the common masses when such influential leaders hold such superstitions and naive views on scientific matters? They are obviously gripped by the unfounded and inexplicable fear of God and his machinations, which they see in every physical phenomenon. Is there a monsoon deficit? Okay, so let's read the Mandaka Sutra of the Rig Veda, invoke the frogs and make them croak the rains in. Are ships sinking due to floods? Okay, let us chant the Varuna Sukta and offer coconuts to the Lord of the ocean. Has there been a plague epidemic? The easiest panacea is the sacrifice of a goat. I don't know what would be for Corona though. On Eid, let's commemorate a mass slaughter of innocent animals and cows, and presto, your God up there is suddenly mighty pleased with you. Is God too as corrupt and self-serving as our honorable district collector, who will not act until he is offered a handsome gift of a dozen ripe mangoes? Does any rationale or logic even support this kind of credulous and gullible beliefs? Unquote. So as you see, it's very, very heavy duty, and even to say something like this in India today in 2020 would actually hurt a lot of people's emotions and religious sentiments. So to be saying this in the 1920s and 30s shows again the timelessness and the far-sighted vision of someone like Savarkar, which is also one reason why probably he did not become as popular, where he was looking at such far-reaching changes. I'd end probably with what an interesting anecdote. We don't know how true it was. So it's in some public rally, I think, after he took over as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, many people were felicitating him. Now, as you know, those days, political ideologies didn't make two people enemies. The leftists like Dange, or M.N. Roy held Savarkar in great esteem and called him Comrade Savarkar all the time. Even members of the Congress were people who were in his support, and vice versa. There was healthy opposition, but you were not an enemy. So someone, I think, from the leftist parties in that public felicitation on stage said, we only understand and respect the Savarkar before Kalapani, the revolutionary Savarkar, the young Savarkar, who had revolution on his mind. After that, we don't accept you. Almost trying to say that the Hindutva agenda of his was not something that they agree with. So when Savarkar's turn comes to speak, he then says that, all that I did of the revolution was before 1911. So now it's 1937, 38. So it's taken you 20, 25 years to understand and appreciate the Savarkar of that time. It will take you probably another 50 years to understand and appreciate the Savarkar of now. But then that's fine. That's how it is, because a social reformer is never going to be a popular figure. He is going to be attacked, assaulted, and the guiding principle for him, and as it needs to be for all social reformers, is Varam Janahitam Dheyam Kevalam Na Janastuti. it is the larger good of people that needs to matter, and not kevalam janastuti, adulations and praises from them. So that's why, as we speak, whether a flyover needs to be named after him, whether he needs to be given a Bharat Ratna, whether a bust of his comes in Delhi University, all this will become the matter of debate, a very ugly debate at that, with a lot of animosity, personal allegations, insinuations. But I don't think that would matter to him at all, because if it is something of Janahita, the larger public good, once again, tying that same common thread of utilitarianism that I began with, I think that's what would matter to a man like Savarkar. So once again, thank you very much. And Raviji, I'm now open for questions.
Many thanks, Dr. Vikram Sampath. You spoke with a lot of passion and it was very insightful. You talk about Savarkar as a social reformer, as revolutionary, as a patriot. And by the time we had got few questions, specifically from Nikhil Sathe and all others. And lastly, you touched on these questions also, I think, these questions are about Savarkar as a rationalist. So I've heard you before also. I think because of paucity of time, you couldn't speak much on Savarkar as a poet or a writer. So that is one part. But I'll start taking questions. There are a number of questions that our viewers have asked us. I've clubbed a few of those questions so that they can be answered simultaneously. Bharat UA and Jayavardhan Joshi from Bhopal, while you were talking about Hindu Rashtra. So this question came from a couple of people, that how much of that can happen if we see it in the context of today and depending on our current foreign policy. And I see a backdrop to this question because when you spoke, so it seems that Veer Savarkar was very prophetic in terms of a number of issues, including foreign policy. Maybe it was because of his deep understanding of India, its people, culture, ethos, and he was very learned as well. Yeah. So that is why I think this question has come.
So the question being, how much of this is possible to implement?
Possible today, bringing the neighboring countries together under one a larger concept of Hindu Rashtra, etc.
I don't know if that was his idea, whether to bring all the neighboring countries under the concept of Hindu Rashtra. I think, like I mentioned in his policy, anybody who is your friend, did I not mention that? One second. Anybody who's your friend, you need to deal with them in that way. And anybody not being driven by all these political isms, Nazism, fascism, because that particular country is following a particular policy, we believe in that, so we will support. Are they of use to you? In foreign policy, there are no permanent enemies or friends, only permanent national interests. That is the guiding principle for most countries. India, unfortunately, for a long time did not perhaps follow that. Like I mentioned, in terms of our Israel policy as one of the examples, on several other counts. So slowly, I think we are coming towards that viewpoint where at least under the current dispensation, a lot of decisions are based on an India first policy, and India's interests policy, where our friendships too can change depending on how your friend reacts to you. So you can't be a friend for life when the person is actually stabbing your back.
Right. So there are a couple of suggestions. I think many of them just saying they're eagerly looking forward to the second part of your book. Okay, and I'm going to take another question from Kannad Mandke. So he's saying, Vikram, a great comprehensive talk. You have often called Savarkar a bundle of contradictions. What do you think some of his main contradictions are? Furthermore, what do you think are the limits of his ideology thought process? Though you did mention that he was not speaking on every other topic like Gandhi did. But I think if you would like to add something else on this question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Kannad is himself a very Savarkar Abhyasi. He's studied a lot on Savarkar, I know, and we've had a couple of discussions. The contradictions I usually mention about him are also his about the kind of personality that he was. I mean, to be a revolutionary, to have that revolutionary zeal, to be so cold-blooded as to go and either murder or inspire someone to murder someone, get bomb manuals printed and shipped back to India, and things like this, which need a certain mindset of what today would be called a terrorist. At the same time, a person who is also a very sensitive poet, who just goes to the seashore in Brighton and is so overwhelmed by emotion that when he's with his friend Niranjan Pal, he breaks into that famous Marathi poem Sagara Pran Tadmadala, where his bhav vibhor hoke he gets into this poetry. So these kind of contradictions, where on the one hand he is also a Nirishwar Vadi, not a firm, ritualistic believer of any theological religion. At the same time, he's also talking about political Hindutva, political Hinduism as a counter to political Islam, and how that needs to be a bulwark against it. So I wonder how, when you don't so much believe in the cultural, the religious aspects of Hinduism, could you also then talk about the political mobilization, which needs to have some basis? So in his case, of course, he propounded it based on that Punya Bhu Pitru Bhu concept, where it is the country that becomes that. But along with that, the religious connotation of it, he almost stayed away. And throughout his life, he was someone who, including for his own, on his own death, he had willed that there should be no traditional funeral, there should be no shrads, there should be no all these other things that need to be done for him. So I mention him as a bundle of contradictions in this context, where there are seemingly opposite viewpoints, which sometimes become hard to reconcile, but that's how the man has been.
Right. Thank you. So there is another question from Amit Shevde. He's saying that you mentioned Dr. Ambedkar and Savarkar never met, but there was some beliefs that Dr. Ambedkar met Savarkar's lawyer who was defending Savarkar in Gandhi assassination case. Can you throw some light on that meeting?
Yeah, so this is also the lawyer was L.B. Bhopatkar. Bhopatkar was in a book, Dharamveer Bhopatkar, which was written by Indra Prakash, who was one of the secretaries of the Hindu Mahasabha, who's written several other books, including History of the Hindu Mahasabha. There he has mentioned that Ambedkar, who was then the law minister, had called Bhopatkar to meet him. And in that meeting, he had said that the Nehru government is hell-bent on implicating Savarkar in a very weak case. And since he's your client, I'm just bringing it to your notice as to what is being done. Now, and Bhopatkar had written this down in his diary. Now, he is the lawyer of Savarkar. So one doesn't know, as a good lawyer, whether he's just to defend his client. Unfortunately, Bhopatkar and Ambedkar are not around to give credence to that meeting. These are all the conjectures of history that happen. So we need to take the Bhopatkar's word for what it is. And if the proof of the pudding is the fact that the case was weak, the case was false, which is why it fell through in court. The court would not be influenced by Savarkar or anybody else's personality. So it, in all its wisdom, the Honorable Court, went through the evidences, and all the other accused were punished, and Godse and Apte were hanged. But then Savarkar was the only one who was acquitted. So for want of evidence, so that itself shows that it was a very false case. All that Yashasvi Hoon Ya and all those things that were attributed to him. So it becomes clear that probably what Bhopatkar said to a large extent was right, but how conclusively and definitively we can say that, as I said, it's a conjecture, because these are diaries of a lawyer, and maybe he was being an extra good lawyer who was defending his client to the last T.
Okay. So there is another comment from Gaurav Goyal from Haryana. He's just mentioning that when terrorism was at its peak in Punjab Kesari had run a series for years on Savarkarji, and then it got stopped. So just a comment I shared. There is a question from Renu Soman in Mumbai. She's asked, how do we plan to introduce Veer Savarkar to the new generation, out of the books and into practical real life?
Well, I think it starts from books, and I'm a writer, I'm a historian, so my work would be limited to books. But even there, that doesn't get fructified, and I do have I always at a lot of self-peril, maybe I keep mentioning it, that even now, in the last 6 years of a dispensation change, we have not really done much to ensure that our history books are given a revision in the way that it needs to, not on the basis of some fancy loony-ness, but on the basis of, get a group of scholars who can sit and clean up a lot of the mess that has been left behind in our history books, because the history that a child reads in school, what his or her teacher teaches, that becomes the fundamental belief that many of them carry on all through their lives. So that is not being corrected. And we've had even our former HRD minister, Javadekar ji, who has gone on record to say not a word has been changed in our history books, as though that is a matter of pride. It should be a matter one should be ashamed of. So there is no proactiveness on this at all. No seriousness when it comes to issues of culture and education. So when the governments don't do things, I think it's left to individuals. So books become the first step, no doubt. But I think other popular media, particularly which are popular with young people, maybe now web series, films, comic strips, all kinds of other things that are there, and through social media, where there are so many avenues to bust all these myths. I always keep mentioning there are these handles of True Indology and others who are able to counter some of the most serious so-called academic historians and their myths that went unchallenged for decades, is able to be busted through sources. My dear friend Abhas, who also puts up wonderful long posts on Twitter with a lot of sources that he gathers. These are the new age, warriors of truth, who will be able to not base their arguments, discussions only on rhetoric, on lack of knowledge, but somebody who actually, does that. So even as we wait for the governments of the time of whichever party to wake up from their deep slumber and decide to do what is their national duty to do, I think a lot of individuals like us who are well-meaning in our own ways. Someone like me can write only an academic book. I'm not a social media, person, or someone who can do those kind of things. So there are different departments in which I think different people are doing such matters, which are very, very important to, if the truth needs to be propagated in the way it needs to.
Okay, thanks. So another question from Vijendra Acharya, that Savarkar was acquitted earlier from the Gandhi assassination case, but there was something which came up in the Kapoor Commission. So can you throw some light on that?
Yeah, so this again in detail I'll be talking in my second volume, but then it suffices to say that the Kapoor Commission report, the Jeevanlal Kapoor Commission, JL Kapoor Commission, that was set up in the 1960s after a debate in Parliament where a lot of discussion happened that this needs to be revisited, and the circumstances need to be seen so many years after Gandhiji's death. Though we don't know, I mean, if the court had acquitted Savarkar, and if there was such strong evidence, then why didn't Nehru's government go in appeal against the judgment? They had everything at their disposal. He could have been fixed right then and there. So there were several other political considerations that was in place, because one of the conjectures is that the whole Kapoor Commission was set up in a way to fix Morarji Desai, who was also becoming a threat some way within the Congress, and Morarji Desai, who was in charge of the law and order and so on that time, was and the Nagarwala Commission report, which investigated Gandhi's murder, also mentions how there was already information that Gandhi's life was under threat, and then despite that, the security cover, etc., there was breach in that. So Gandhi was kept safe under British rule, but immediately after independent Indian rule, his life was not safe, which itself is quite a travesty. So somewhere I think Morarji Desai had to be fixed. The terms of reference of this Kapoor Commission, nowhere was it to reinvestigate the role of Savarkar in it. So, and many of the witnesses who were there, Appa Kasar, who was his bodyguard, Gajanan Damle, and others, these people were not even called by the commission as witnesses. Otherwise, it had about 109 or 110 witnesses whom they spoke to. The key people, the ones who said that Yashasvi Houn, he gave a pistol to him, these people were not even spoken to. And we had Nathuram Godse's own testimony in court where he said Savarkar never, he had no knowledge of this conspiracy, and I had actually got so disillusioned with him and moved away from him way back in the 1940s. So despite that, the Kapoor Commission, without going into the details of the investigation by calling all the relevant witnesses or going beyond the terms of reference that they were given, they came out with this one-line, declaration that he was also involved in it, and undoubtedly he is one of the culprits. Now, on what basis was that arrived at? And if it was actually, it had any truth in it, Indira Gandhi's government was there, she could have taken action on it. There was nothing, the report was just there to malign someone for life, and then that got disposed of. And by then, of course, Savarkar was also dead. So there was, I think, this again, these become, and we know how politically motivated commissions in India can do their work time and time again. So with all due respect to such commissions that get established, whichever way you want the truth to be fixed, I think commissions have a way of doing it in India.
Right. Thank you. I would request you to do some good to our viewers, because this question is repeatedly coming. Give us a date on launch of second volume.
Good Lord. I know I wish it could have been earlier, but this lockdown has ensured that I'm not able to travel so much for research work, but still continuing to write for the second volume. And I'm hoping that by the middle of next year, it should come out, because like I mentioned, it's very important that a definitive account comes of the man with all the facts, records, everything put on in place, because then the best part of it is most of the leftist academicians, or even the leftist media, or those who with a leftist bent of mind, most of them or all of them have really had nothing to criticize in the first volume, which is I don't know which is a good or bad thing. Because when you counter truth, when you have truth on your side, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So when you have truth on your side, and when you have all the facts staring at you, to be able to counter that, you need to do double the amount of research. So when I have 100 pages only of notes and bibliography, someone who wants to counter that needs to put in 200 pages of notes and bibliography, and research is a very hard task. Everybody in these 140 characters a day, quickly, in Arnab Goswami style, tell me yes or no, tell me yes or no. So that sort of thing, where 30 seconds is all your information attention span is, in such a scenario, people don't have the patience or the time to sit in archives and dusty libraries for 3 years, 4 years to be able to ferret information. So that, unfortunately, my apologies that it takes that amount of time, but I assure you and I hope that it will be well worth the wait. And by middle of next year, I hope I can present to all of you and to the nation the rest of the untold story of Veer Savarkar.
Right. Okay. So I would like to take the last bunch of 3 questions, and I have not bunched them together because they are similar in nature. But all these issues you have touched in your talk, but then I think they've asked it again. So if you want to add something, you can do it. So Nikhil Sathe has asked, Savarkar mentioned secularism as differentiation of state and religion and not Sarva Dharm Sambhav. Please put some light on it. And then there is another question from Omkar Lele. Please throw some light on Hindu as dharma and not religion as propounded by Savarkarji. And there's third and last question from Mohit Bulani. The question is, okay, did Veer Savarkar work for independence after he was released from jail? So you touched all these 3 questions in some of the other way. So I just put all these 3 questions together. So you can take them. Thanks.
So yeah, so like I'll probably take the last one first, because that's more interesting. So did he work for independence after jail? Now, after being out of jail, now one must understand that he came out of jail on a conditional release, that he would restrict his activities to Ratnagiri district in Maharashtra, and he would stay away from politics. Now this was 1924. Now he had to stay away from politics for a period of 5 years. Now that was extended every 2 years till 1937. So 1924 to 1937, it was 13 years. Now that itself in some way, busts this whole idea that this man had become a British stooge. Because if you were a British stooge, if you were their friend, why would they be keeping you in house arrest? They would be more than happy to ally with you, take your help, and not keep you under house arrest. So the fact that till the very end, the British did not trust him, they had apprehensions about him. He was always categorized as a D category, dangerous criminal that he was while he was a student in London. That seems to have remained all through. So only in 1937, when the interim the governments were being formed in different parts of India, the Bombay government was formed on the condition of Jamna Das Mehta that unless Savarkar gets released, I will not take over in the new Bombay government, which was sworn in after the 1935 Government of India Act. So it was then that he was released. So all through this time, like I mentioned, the Savarkar brothers were indirectly giving support to the revolutionaries, actively, tacitly. What extent of support, it becomes very difficult to say. But so what did Chandrasekhar Azad and Babarao Savarkar sit and talk in that Panda's house in Kashi, in some narrow lane, in 1927, 28? We just have no idea about that. So obviously they were not talking about the weather, they were talking about something more important. And the fact that Subhash Chandra Bose met him before leaving India, what did he discuss? What was it that he said? Was Savarkar's policy of militarized Hindudom, where Hindu men should join the army? Was it a dual-pronged strategy? One is, of course, a lot of the British army was enlisting a lot of Muslims, and the fact that you had the trouble on the western and the eastern frontiers, if a lot of them after independence, if they were still in the army and you had no counter, then an army attack on India could well be possible. So to counter that, we needed military strength. The other was again the same 1857 model on which also Young Italy and Abhinav Bharat worked, which is infiltrate the army, learn the art of warfare, and then defect from that. And that's exactly what happened with a lot of men defecting from the British Indian Army to the Indian National Army of Subhash Bose, and thereby forming, spearheading the naval mutiny and getting us our freedom finally. So all of this would contribute to the freedom struggle. So when we say freedom struggle too, that's where the problem arises, where there is only that one thread, which we are taught. 1920, 1918, 19, where the Champaran, then the Chauri, the non-cooperation movement, then the civil disobedience movement, then Dandi March. And then Quit India. So anybody who comes outside this straight line has not contributed anything to the freedom struggle, which is not how it was, because there were parallel movements going on in every part of a large country like India. Of course, Gandhi's movement was a mass movement which helped arouse that national sentiment and a mass awareness. But that is not to discount the role and importance of numerous other individuals, people of armed conflict that was happening in at different times and different parts of India. And time again, when you actually analyze, every time the British gave concessions to us, right from the 1909, Morley-Minto reforms, 1919, you had the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, then the whole idea of the Simon Commission coming in, and then leading, of course, to the government, the Round Table conferences, the Government of India Act. All of it was preceded with violent acts in different parts of India. So somewhere I feel लातों के भूत बातों से नहीं मानते. So it was always the fact that these armed conflicts were the ones that shook the British Empire. It was not as my dear friend Sanjeev Sanyal, often says that we didn't ask the British very, graciously, politely that please quit India, and they decided, okay, you're asking us so much, so let us pack our bags and go. So that was not how India won her freedom, and that parallel story of the true freedom of struggle of India needs to come out. So that was one question. The other was about Sarva Dharma Sambhav.
Yeah, so about the secularism definition of secularism as...
I don't think that term even existed even for Ambedkar and for the Constituent Assembly debates. We know how surreptitiously the word secularism got into our constitution during the emergency. So the separation of state and religion, it's again a very European construct. So, but then where he says again that, you can have your individual religious beliefs, even if it comes to things like cow worship and so on. If you want to believe in it, you believe in it. Though he said he doesn't believe in that whole concept. But then that should not interfere in matters of public policy, or where the nation is put to peril because of those beliefs. Like he quotes, it happened during the Islamic invasions, where the other side would put a battery of cows, and the Indian side would not shoot their arrows because they saw the cow and it would hurt it, or so on. And in the process, you lost your whole country, your honor, and everything. So that to that extent, I would say the distinction between state and religion is what he propounded. But then his whole the idea that I mentioned, where you can give grants to religious institutions, they're allowed to do their duty. The state is not going to interfere. The state is not going to encroach upon your religious rights. So all that I think is actually, I mean, this is a much maligned world of secularism. Nobody understands what it is. You can fit it in. It's a glove that can fit any kind of hand. So, so one doesn't know what exactly who means by that. And particularly to an Indian context, where religion is the opium of the masses. You can't take away religion from the life of Indians. It's an integral part, and that I always say that's one reason Gandhiji became so popular, because he understood that. He understood that religion cannot be separated from our beliefs. So he had this quasi-saintly garb to him. And even now, our new age gurus have so many followers, right? So somebody who's sitting in a saintly manner, meditating, then having bhajans, and you're talking of Ram Rajya and Raghupati Raghav Raja Ram. So everybody is clapping around in, that ecstasy. So that way he is able to capture the imagination of the masses. A very, very, very important and interesting way of capturing people's interest first, and then mobilizing them towards politics. So to that extent, hats off to Gandhiji for being able to understand that. Even when he did the Khilafat movement, the way to capture the weak nerve, jo hai logon ka dukti rag, so wo pakad ke how to happily take that into politics. You like the Caliph of Turkey, acha, he's been dispossessed, I will help fight his case, but in turn you come and join my non-cooperation movement. So it's how religion can be used that way. So no way we were secular ever in our freedom struggle time, if you go to say, considering how much religion was a part of it. So post-independence, the definitions become very, very different and murky according to me. Right. And what was the other question? I lost it.
I think it got covered. I don't remember now, but then I think
okay.
Yeah. So, I think it was independence after he was released from jail. So I think you covered that also. So, okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Vikram Sampath. I would like to call Ravindra Sathe ji again to formally give a vote of thanks to you. But before that, on behalf of our viewers, let me wish you belated happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Over to Sathe ji.
Yes, thank you, Vikram ji, for taking out time, and it was a wonderful interaction. Thanks for your insightful and motivating speech. You did mention about Sanjeev Sanyal. Sanjeev Sanyal ने आपके पुस्तक के बारे में जो कहा था, I will just read out the 2 lines what he said about your book. He said, read it not just to understand Savarkar, but also to understand the emergence of modern India. मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि इसी अभिप्राय में सावरकर जी के बारे में डॉक्टर संपत जी ने लिखा है, वो जरूर आप पढ़िए. आपने जरूर पुस्तक खरीदनी चाहिए और पढ़नी चाहिए. थैंक यू वंस अगेन डॉक्टर संपत, एंड डू विजिट आवर इंस्टीट्यूट व्हेनेवर यू इन मुंबई.
थैंक यू.
हम आपको हृदय से आमंत्रित करते हैं. आप जरूर मुंबई में जब आएंगे तो जरूर संस्था को विजिट करिए. हम बंगलोर आएंगे तो आपको जरूर मिलेंगे, ऑफ कोर्स आफ्टर लॉकडाउन.
Yes, बिल्कुल. And I do hope Mumbai remains safe with the kind of cases that are rising these days. Yeah.
Or belated happy birthday again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
ये बहुत ही अच्छा कोइंसिडेंस है कि कल आपका बर्थ था, ये बर्थ एनिवर्सरी, ये आपका जन्मदिन था और आज सावरकर जी की बर्थ एनिवर्सरी है. So it's a great coincidence.
Yes,
so
indeed.
Many thanks again, and all the thanks to yours for your response. एक बात मैं और कहना चाहूंगा कि ये जो पूरा भाषण है, कार्यक्रम है, ये YouTube पे भी बाद में आपको उपलब्ध होगा. तो जो भी दर्शक देखना चाहेंगे आप फिर से देख सकते हैं. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद.
बहुत धन्यवाद. शुक्रिया. नमस्कार.